Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris and I'm your instructor for this course. And I do apologize for that. Tonight we're going to be concluding the third part of chapter 21. Let's see here, pull up my little notes here. The Modern Nation 1919 to 1928. So we're going to pick up where we left off with the last part. This is part 3 of the lecture, with the limits of modern culture. Now, there were limits with this prosperity. As we've talked about, the 1920s are the teenage years. There's immense prosperity during this time period. We're seeing the age of consumerism. We're seeing new inventions emerging during this time. We're seeing, like I talked about, the washing machine. For instance, we're seeing a whole new advent of consumer products. We're seeing the first cosmetics emerge. But we're also seeing low income persist. The low income aspect of American society hasn't disappeared, even though there's this great advent of these consumer products. There's still a great deal of low income areas of cities persisting. Many Americans still did not own their own homes, even though I've talked about this idea of Americans seeking out mortgages to buy their own homes. There are still many Americans that did not own their own homes. And towns were still largely divided by social class. You have this idea of the wrong side of the tracks, I think I talked about in previous chapters. There's still that emphasis going on. And then into this atmosphere of the 1920s, this rebelling atmosphere of the 1920s, as I emphasize this idea of the 1920s being like the teenage years of the United States, we have this lost generation of intellectuals. Where the World War One represented a failure of civilizations. These intellectuals saw World War One as being this triumphant failure of these major empires of Europe imploding. And if they could not come out of World War One, if they essentially crumbled and fell in on themselves, and the only one of the great empires to emerge from World War One was the United States. I mean, the peon United States that is this new nation of upstarts. I mean, they really viewed it as kind of pathetic that this nation of no-name melting pot individuals with no culture of its own, with no identity of its own, that was kind of thrown together by a bunch of misfits, was the only one nation to emerge intact from the war. And this lost generation really saw it as really disheartening. That's why they felt that they were lost. They didn't have a rudder to steer them any longer. They felt alienated from the U.S. and they left for Europe to try to seek some kind of grounding element in Europe. Some of them even went so far as to renounce their United States citizenship and become kind of these expatriates. That was the big thing to do. They criticized repression, provincialism, and routinized their work and superficial pleasures. They expressed ambivalence about modernity. They saw modernity as being ultimately what had led to the destruction of the great empires of Europe. Ultimately, they explained that to be what had led to World War One and what had destroyed the great cultures of Europe. So this is what these lost generation of intellectuals, and what I'm talking about are the ones like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, um, these great Ring Lardner. These are the great intellectuals of that generation, that lost generation. We also see fundamentalist Christians and old time religion becoming big at this time. They rejected liberalism, they believed in the historical truth of the Bible. They were strongest in the South and West, and they came to dominate the Southern Baptist Convention. We also see at this time the trial of John Scopes for teaching evolution. Now, John Scopes is this teacher who gets this idea of teaching evolution at a time when evolution was still a new scientific concept that had come about. It's been around for a little while at this point in time. It's around 1850s that it's popularized by Charles Darwin. But really, it's made it into the science books. It's now made it into textbooks that now it's starting to be percolate into school curriculum. And John Scopes is this teacher that decides to emphasize it in his curriculum. Well, he fails to realize that you probably should not do this in an area where it's around the Bible Belt. And it's really here that he finds himself in a whole lot of trouble, because he's actually brought before the law for teaching it, because it's seen as extraordinarily controversial. In fact, criminally controversial for this time. Something that's blaspheming God. And he's actually brought before a court of law for teaching evolution. And it goes so far that they bring in an expert witness on God and the Bible, one William Jennings Bryan, who famously defends God and the Bible, and testifies on behalf of God and the Bible. We remember Mr. Bryan from his famous Cross of Gold speech that we mentioned in the previous lecture. Some of you may have read the play Inherit the Wind when you were in high school. I don't know if they still encourage reading Inherit the Wind. It may be under the banned book category. But when I was in high school, Inherit the Wind was a required reading. But it's based off the Scopes, what they call the Scopes monkey trial. So if you do remember reading that or have heard about it, I do encourage you to read Inherit the Wind. Then we talk about nativists and immigration restriction. Now, we see with the with the mass migration from Europe, that these nativist attitudes and immigration restriction ideas see a mass revival. There's an association of immigrants with anarchism and radicalism that begins to take hold. And we see the Immigration Act of 1921 and 1924 establishing quotas by country, with an exclusion for Asian immigrants. Now, you're probably wondering why Asian immigrants are excluded. Well, there's probably a reason behind this, being that Asians are seen as being very handy in the agriculture industry, especially on the West Coast at this point in time in history. there's more of a focus on Eastern Europeans because of this movement towards the fears over anarchism and this radicalization. They don't see, at this point in time, Asian Americans as being too big a threat. This is going to shift, obviously, in about 20 years when we start to see, again, a great fear of Asian Americans, which I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I think you probably know where I'm going with this. But right now, at this point in time in American history, Asians are seen as semi-valuable. I say semi-valuable because there's still fears and concerns over them. Obviously, we're not going to be running up to them and with open arms going, hey, you can own land. Hey, you can be equals with us. Obviously, that's not going to happen. There's still exclusionary practices that are practiced across the United States towards them. You know, we don't see anybody but our still the Anglo American as being greeted with completely open arms. Still, obviously, even our Native American peoples are still being excluded from full citizenship rights. And even with the Dawes Act, you know, we're still not going to be granting citizenship rights to Native Americans until 1919. So we're still practicing exclusionary practices towards other people. We're still finding ways to exclude. We don't want to even get into the whole thing with territories. Territories, United States territories, is a dicey subject that I could spend a whole lecture in of itself talking about our little territory issue, that we still don't want to acknowledge territories fully. Yeah, territories are ours, and yeah, we want to say that territories are ours, and we want to give certain rights to people that live in our territories. And at the same time, we don't want to fully acknowledge them as being part of our country. Um, and we want to give all sorts of legal reasons. But what it comes down to is there's this whole thing that goes all the way back to this time period of, yeah, they're a lesser people than us, and we don't want to bring people into the union that aren't like us. Yeah, we go back to these exclusionary mindsets of a bygone era, and it's an ugly, ugly, ugly thing that we don't like to talk about because it's ugly, it's racist, it's in our past, and we just don't want to talk about it. And we almost had to talk about it, which we'll get into hopefully if we get through these chapters. When we had the hurricane back during President Donald Trump's presidency, and Puerto Rico got hit by the hurricane, and we were for the first time faced with a disaster in a United States territory, and we kind of got forced into a dilemma about how much aid to send to a United States territory. And were the Puerto Ricans our citizens? Well, yes, well, no, well, maybe, well, sort of, well, you know, we need to assist, and, well, how much assistance do we offer? And, yeah, it got really uncomfortable for us. And the reason was this unresolved issue of the Puerto Rican territory issue that looms back to this era. So we'll get into that hopefully before the end of this course. So anyway, then we see the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, these fond little fellas are not gone. And again, I have to emphasize here that the Ku Klux Klan of this era is not the redneck guys like we see nowadays in the back of a rusty old pickup truck going, "What power?" These are scary folks. These are the folks that I probably should have emphasized in an earlier lecture, but I'll emphasize here. I know this movie gets a lot of criticism, obviously, for its horrendously racist overtones. But there is one particular scene out of this movie called Birth of a Nation. And I can't say enough about this particular scene. I sometimes show it when I teach this class in the classroom because it depicts perfectly the absolute terror and fear that the Ku Klux Klan of this era and the era from the Civil War on, the Ku Klux Klan was able to inflict on their victims. These men would dress up, if you can call it dressing up, it's a terrible thing to describe, in complete white hoods, in their full regalia, down to even dressing their horses in the same regalia. And they would charge in on horseback into towns, usually under the cover of darkness, to terrify and terrorize the citizens, usually carrying torches, to inflict terror on their intended targets. When they come back in the 1920s, they're a little bit more open. They're not generally, under the cover of darkness. You'll see the depictions of them marching down Main Street under broad daylight because they've been continuing to practice their heinous little acts, gradually moving more and more out into mainstream. Because if you remember, under the bargain of 1877, they've been slowly infecting the Deep South and continuing to practice their little antics, without fear of retribution from the federal government. So they've been getting their hooks and their tendrils and whatever else into the Deep South pretty deeply. So they're becoming more and more outward with their practices. So by the 1920s, when they fully become acknowledged as, a organization again, they're out and proud in the city streets. And it's pretty well known that many of these people are prominent city officials. And there is even rumor that they may be even some higher officials. I won't say federal officials, but I will simply say higher officials, that are carrying on these antics as well. And it's not a secret organization as it's made out to be. Many people know under those hoods who's who. They're not going to openly acknowledge that, hey, isn't that George so-and-so? But they're going to have a pretty darn good idea of who's who, simply by who's getting into what vehicle. It's going to be like, oh yeah, isn't that Billy Bob getting in that pickup truck? Isn't that his pickup truck? Oh yeah, I think it is. It's going to be, a very good knowledge of who belongs and who doesn't belong to the Ku Klux Klan. And they've adopted their white hoods and the cross burnings as their calling cards. I had a student a few years after I first started teaching at Valley, And this gentleman was an amazing person, a testament to living under this system of living in the Deep South. And he spoke up at the beginning of class and he said, I want to tell you about what it was like to live in the Deep South before the Civil Rights Movement. He said, my parents lived in, I forgot where it was, whether it was Alabama or where. And he said, we lived in constant fear of lynchings. He said, we lived every night. You'd hear the trucks of the KKK going up and down the dirt roads. White boys hooping and hollering. And you'd hear about another lynching. And he said, finally, what made my parents decide to move away was the night that the next door neighbor got dragged out of his house and lynched. And my father decided that it was no longer safe for us. He decided that we might be next. So he said, we packed up and we moved. And he said, where do you think we moved to? And we listened, and he said, we moved to South Central LA. We moved to Watts. And he said, Watts, 1960s. And he said, you know what? He said, some people might think that it was a worse experience. And he said, no, it wasn't. He said, it was a far better place to live. He said, yeah, you had cops. He said, yeah, we had the riots. But he said, I'll tell you this much. I knew who the people were that weren't good. And I knew how to keep myself straight. And he said, I didn't live in fear of being lynched. And he said, I knew who my friends were. And I knew who the bad people were. And he said, I had a wonderful life in Watts. And he said, that might sound contradictory to the stories you've heard. But he said, it was a much better place to live. And he said, even going through the riots was much better than living in the Deep South. Because he said, there you lived in constant fear of what was waiting for you at the next moment. He said, you don't know what kind of fear that was. And to hear him tell that story, I can't do it justice. I honestly can't do it justice. But to see the look on his face, you knew that what he'd experienced was something none of us can understand. That it was terrible. He spoke about the cross burnings. He said you'd see the remnants of the crosses burned on people's lawns. But he said the real thing that frightened you more than anything was hearing about who had been lynched. And he said that's what they did a lot around where he lived. He said the cross burnings was one thing, but the lynching was the worst. And he said there was a lot of it. And believe me, they were equal opportunity haters. They hated Jews, Roman Catholics, immigrants, liberals, in addition to African Americans. That's what I mean by equal opportunity haters. We often think that they just went after or targeted African Americans. There were many people they targeted. They also condemned new gender ideals, big business, modern culture, and youth culture. However, this is the interesting thing that's contradictory to the Ku Klux Klan. They began using advertising and technology to spread their message. So they were against the youth culture, yet they began harnessing advertising and technology to reach their target audiences. And who do you imagine probably utilized those methods the most? Was probably the youth that reached that the most and heard that the most was the youth. And fed into those messages the most was youth. So interesting, it contradicts it. So something to think about. Now that I've fed into the dark, grim Reaper side of my persona, now we're going to turn to something a little bit more positive. We're going to focus on the Mexican Americans of this era. We see an increase in Mexican immigration during this time. Now, interestingly enough, immigration of Mexican immigrants was largely unrestricted by Congress. And of course, we have immigration because we have the Mexican Revolution going on. And we also have a growing U.S. economy. Now we have the National Origins Act that's passed at this time, that as a component of the Immigration Act of 1924, it established a quota system for determining how many immigrants could enter the United States, restricted by country of origin. So there is this National Origins Act that's in place. So there is a slight restriction on how many immigrants can enter the country. And again, with like most of the immigrants that are entering the United States, our Mexican immigrants develop this strong sense of community. And feeding into this strong sense of community is this idea of La Raza. Many of you probably have heard this term. And it actually is a Spanish expression that's defined as the people, or the race, that has historically been used to refer to the Hispanophone populations, primarily, though not always exclusively, in the Western Hemisphere, which is considered as an ethnic or racial unit historically derived from the Spanish Empire and the racial intermixing of the Spanish colonizers with the indigenous populations of the Americas. And some people have utilized this term to include racial mixing with the enslaved Africans brought here by the Atlantic slave trade as well. So this term comes to signify the sense of community that is brought in to the United States as well. And actually, it's going to have another connotation as well moving forward historically. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So now we're going to look at another group that has a significant change during the 1920s, which is African Americans. And I know some of you are going to cringe at this. I apologize. This is not meant to offend, because this is a popularized term during this era of the new Negro. And I know if you take offense, I do apologize, but this is actually what this movement is entitled during this era. So, poverty and discrimination created a common identity. The struggle for economic progress and equal rights unified African Americans during this era. And one of the most prominent movements during this time is the Harlem Renaissance. Now, it's actually an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, and scholarship centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, that spanned from the 1920s and 1930s. We'll see people like Ethel Waters, Duke Ellington, Elaine Locke. I'm trying to remember some of the other prominent figures, because we also have numerous artists that emerge out of this particular period. There are so many amazing dancers. Josephine Baker. Just astounding number. I could go on naming countless artists that come out of this period. Billie Holiday, that emerged from this time period. And at the time, it was known as the New Negro Movement. It was actually named after the New Negro, a 1925 anthology edited by Elaine Locke. The movement also included the new African American cultural expressions across the Northeast and Midwest United States, affected by a renewed militancy in the general struggle for civil rights, combined with the great migration of African American workers fleeing the racist conditions of the Jim Crow Deep South, as Harlem was the final destination of the largest number of those who migrated north. So we see this remarkable cultural flowering. It's an amazing, transformative period of cultural, political, scholarly expressions. Some of them are critiques, even scholarly critiques of other artists that are responding to this cultural flowering. How patrons, because a lot of these artists were actually had white patrons. So there was some criticism that whites were actually potentially, I won't say manipulating, but perhaps influencing in some regards the artistic endeavors. So Langston Hughes actually wrote a collection of poems and short stories called The Ways of White Folks, which is actually, if you study it very carefully, is actually a critique that plays on W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks. So it's kind of a stab at the Harlem Renaissance and how people were, white patrons were perhaps manipulating the outcome of the Harlem Renaissance. So it's kind of an interesting way of how the Renaissance was perhaps being a scholarly look at the Harlem Renaissance from a different perspective. Langston Hughes had actually made a critique on, was the Renaissance purely a African American movement? But if you look at it from the perspective of how many artists, how many scholars, how many writers, the generation of work that came out of that time, you have to realize that it was a genuine movement of artistic endeavor that came out of that time, whoever was funding it. So it's kind of an interesting period to study and look at the body of work that was generated during that time period. The development of the NAACP and the civil rights movement we see during this period of time, which we've talked about before. And then Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which is something else that we haven't talked about. Marcus Garvey came up with this idea of creating a completely he created this idea of moving people back to Africa, gathering essentially a nation of people here in the United States to move back to Africa, to return them to their homeland, that they could not be one nation here, unified with whites, that it would be better to move them back to Africa. He began kind of gathering people together, pooling their funds. Ultimately, he was charged with mail fraud, and ultimately found guilty of mail fraud. There was no genuine movement to get people to move back to Africa after all. His efforts were in vain. But for a long time, he actually had tried to orchestrate this effort to try to build a movement. I think it started in, if I remember correctly, the Bahamas or Barbados was where he had originated this idea, and then brought it to New York City and actually fostered the effort to move African Americans to Africa and start his own kind of colony of African Americans who had been relocated to Africa to start this new colony. So anyway, with that, we're going to move on to a new era in politics and government. The modern political system, the use of advertising. So we're going to see a growth in the use of advertising to help with political campaigns. We've already talked about before the use of advertising in advancing campaigns and how it's growing more sophisticated in helping candidates reach their target audiences to garner support. The media becomes less partisan. We see a gradual drop in the biases, trying to level the playing field. Lobbyists from corporations, professional organizations, and reform groups start playing more prominently into the political field. We're going to see this moving forward, that lobbyists are going to play more and more of a role in politics. Less partisan politics reduce voter turnout. We're going to see this moving forward as there's not going to be this spectacle like we've seen in the past. We're not going to see this strong, vicious division between the parties like we've seen in the past. You're not going to see this. I know you're going to argue with me. What do you mean there's no vitriol between the Republicans and the Democrats? Isn't there? Well, not to the extent that it used to be. You're not going to see candidates exchanging blows. That's the way it used to be done between Republicans and Democrats. You're not going to see that anymore, folks. I know you're going to be like, darn, I wish I could see two candidates come to literally fighting each other on a stage. No, that's not going to happen anymore. And because of that, you're not going to see the voter turnout like it used to be. Then we see the Republican ascendancy. We're going to see Warren G. Harding. He's uncontroversial, very conservative. A return to normalcy is his ploy with the White House. However, the White House is plagued by fraud and corruption. Most notably, the Teapot Dome scandal. Some of you have probably heard about the Teapot Dome scandal, where oil reserves in Wyoming are sold by the head of the by his head of the Interior, the Secretary of the Interior under Harding. He's eventually indicted for the selling these oil reserves in Wyoming. It's a very illegal thing that he does. What ultimately happens is it's the first time that a secretary, a cabinet official, I should say, is indicted. A sitting cabinet official, I should say, is indicted, and actually serves prison time. However, Calvin Coolidge ultimately wins the 1924 election after Harding's untimely death. Now, there's an interesting story around Harding's death. Harding is found dead in bed in a state of undress with his lady love. And it's believed that he may have been in a compromising position when he expired. Yes, we may have had a president that was in the throes of lovemaking when he suffered a heart attack. Not certain, but there is reason to speculate that he may have been, yeah. I'm sorry, folks. History does have sometimes some, yeah, we may have had a president that actually died. Yeah. Thought you might like that little aside. But Calvin Coolidge was a very intriguing character. Besides Warren G. Harding, who had a rather interesting end, Coolidge was the opposite. He was a man of few words. They called him Silent Cal. There was a reason for this. The man said very little. There was a woman that actually admitted that at a party she was playing a game with one of her girlfriends, and she told President Coolidge that she had bet her girlfriend that she could get President Coolidge to say more than, I think it was 3 words. And he told her point blank, "You lose." Yep, you lose. 1, 2. Yeah. She lost. That was the kind of person he was. Not a very good party person, clearly. Um, he did not have much of a personality. So, anyway, the politics of individualism denounced the activist progressive state, less government, more individual freedom, reduced budget deficits and the national debt. There's lax enforcement of prohibition regulations on business. I'm going to tell you, folks, prohibition was failing miserably. The liquor was flowing more than ever. If you haven't figured it out, with the Volstead Act, which put into place the 18th Amendment, I will tell you that, guess what? It may have made liquor illegal in the United States. I will tell you this: liquor was still flowing very readily, and I should say alcohol was still flowing very readily. People found ways around legal methods of acquiring alcohol. I think I've already spoken of this. There was medicinal alcohol, i.e., all of a sudden people found many medicinal forms of alcohol. Patent medicines went through, the production patent medicines went through the roof. All of a sudden, everybody had rheumatism, everybody had gout, everybody had anything that required patent medicines that was high proofs of alcohol, so that they were chugging down bottle after bottle after bottle of medicine. Yeah, so much for that. There were many conversions to Catholicism because, hey, you can always get some in the communion wine. Yeah, a lot of conversions. So if you ever happen to be working on your genealogy and you find for a brief period that you had relatives that suddenly converted to Catholicism, like say between those years of Prohibition, yeah, it wasn't because they had a change of faith. It was likely because they were drinking. Yeah, they may have been imbibing. Yeah. Things people went to. And we don't even want to talk about those people that got so desperate that they took to drinking aftershave, perfume, mouthwash, anything that even had a small quantity, cooking sherry, vanilla, cooking vanilla, anything that even had a small quantity of alcohol in it, it got drank. Yeah, I'm sorry, folks. It was a rough time. It was a rough time. And then those brave or unfortunately foolish people that tried to make their own and wound up either blind or dead. Unless they were fortunate enough to actually succeed and survive the endeavor. Yep, just wound up dying young because they slowly poisoned themselves. So then we have Herbert Hoover, who we'll get to in a minute, and his idea of associationalism, which was defined as voluntary partnerships between business and government, which we'll be getting into in a minute. And this idea will come in handy, so he thinks, in helping us once the economy starts to change and starts to kind of slip a bit. But that will be an issue we'll get into when we talk about the tumble with the economy on Black Tuesday. But Republican foreign policy, we have the Washington Naval Conference between 1921 and 1922 that led to an arms reduction. That's also going to have devastating consequences for us. The Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928 that outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. But however, it lacked an enforcement mechanism. Again, that's going to have devastating consequences for us. And ultimately led to increasing our economic involvement around the world. Both of these. And now we're going to talk about extending the new era. Now, Democrats' antagonistic constituents doomed their chances in national races. They ultimately ran Al Smith as Democratic nominee in 1928 by running an Irish Catholic. Now, you're probably thinking, why is that a big deal? Running a Catholic at this point in time in history was a daring move. Catholics are still viewed at this point with a great deal of suspicion. As I mentioned, Eastern Europeans are still associated largely with anarchism. Catholics are right up there with suspicion. Right up there with Mormons. Right up there with all other Eastern Europeans. There's still a high deal of suspicion around all these different faiths, around all these different nationalities. So when they propose running Al Smith, he's not greeted with a great deal of open-armed support. Then you have this urban liberalism that's going around. It all alienated fundamentalists and rural Americans. And in the election of 1928, we ultimately have Herbert Hoover that winds up winning the election. And Hoover is really the person who wins the election. He seems like the most promising candidate. He's a published author. He has a background in economics. He seems like a very sound person. He has a business mind. He seems like he understands how to run a government. But as we are going to find out, he doesn't quite understand where the market is going and where the economy is going. He seems like he does with this idea, as I mentioned, with associationalism, this partnership between business and government. But as we're going to find out, he's not anticipating the big turn where our economy is going to go. And that our economy is going to take a huge hit that's going to break it and bring it to its knees. And the final thing we're going to talk about is J. Walter Thompson and international markets. And American advertising expanded overseas to sell American products. They acquired GM's business and opened a branch office wherever they had a factory, which ultimately allowed them to advertise in these foreign countries, and to actually branch out and advertise in these foreign countries. They could expand and advertise in these different countries and tailor their advertising to these particular countries and find a way to reach each audience in a way that was tailored specifically to these countries. And make sure that their markets were reached in an appropriate manner, and modernize their advertising strategies, which made the company profitable, very profitable, in fact. So with that, we've reached the end of chapter 21. So we will now move on to chapter 22.